Well, if you've joined with us just for the sermon, welcome. It's great that you're here with us. My name's Wayne and I'm one of the ministers at Cosham Baptist Church. Today we're finishing our Finding Freedom series that we've been walking through for the last 7 weeks. So for the last time in this series, let's have a look at our passage from Deuteronomy chapter 7, verses 1 through to 6. When the Lord your God brings you into the land you're about to enter and occupy, he will clear away many nations ahead of you. The Hivites, Girgashites, Amorites, Canaanites, Perizzites, Hivites and Jebusites. These 7 nations are greater and more numerous than you. When the Lord your God hands these nations over to you and you conquer them, you must completely destroy them. Make no treaties with them and show them no mercy. You must not intermarry with them. Do not let your daughters and sons marry their sons and daughters, for they will lead your children away from me to worship other gods. Then the anger of the Lord will burn against you, and he will quickly destroy you. This is what you must do. You must break down their pagan altars and shatter their sacred pillars. Cut down their Asherah poles and burn their idols. For you are a holy people who belong to the Lord your God. Of all the people on the earth, the Lord your God has chosen you to be his own special treasure. If you have journeyed through all 7 of these battles, I just want to say well done to you. You've done really well. I'm afraid I don't have a prize for you if you've done all 7, but it's great that you have. It may have been a bit of a journey for you, because often when we see all of these weird names like Hivites and Amorites and Girgashites and so on and so forth in the Bible, they can seem confusing and irrelevant, can they not, to our modern lives? And at times you may feel like you've done 7 rounds with a champion boxer. But the good news is that if you stick with what we have heard, if we stick with what God has said to us and pick up the tools that he has given us to defeat these enemies, you will not have just done 7 rounds with 7 fighters with 7 enemies, but you will have won. You will have come out the other side and you will walk in the true freedom that Christ has for you. For while what we have looked at is an account from centuries ago, from the Old Testament, I hope you've been able to see that these enemies do have a very real modern day counterpart. And so they are very relevant to our lives in 2020. And also at the moment, as we battle COVID-19 throughout the world, in one sense, is in crisis and is fighting an enemy. And when we're fighting all of these other things that are causing our lives disruption, it is then that these enemies very often rear their ugly head even more. And if we're not careful, if we're not alert, can cause even more disruption in our lives. The gospel of Jesus is all about us living in relationship with him. And the word gospel means good news. And friends, the good news this morning is that your life does not have to be guided and determined by these enemies, but you can have a free life, life in all its fullness that God has for you. You do not have to allow these things to drag you down. So this good news is actually awesome news, because we were truly made for more than the struggles that we may be facing. And we can live a best life that God has for us. So here we go, on to the last enemy, number 7, the Jebusites. Many years ago, I was in Turkey, and I decided, what do you do when you're in Turkey? You have to go to a Turkish bath, don't you? And maybe some of you have been to the Turkish baths as well. And I had no idea what to expect, but I went in and I changed. You're in your swimmers, And there's this huge, looked like a marble slab, really big, much bigger than a dining room table, the size of a room, right in the centre of this room. And on this big slab was real sort of soapy water. And around the slab were a lot of these men, and I have to say, I hope I'm not being disrespectful, they were huge. They were big, burly men, and you sat there with lots of other people, and when it was your turn, they pointed at you and they called you forward and they told you to get onto the slab. And so you climb up onto the slab, and then they put these sort of big mitts on their hands, and then, boy oh boy, did they go to town. They started slapping me, they started dragging me around, they were literally throwing me around and at times passing me from one to the other and turning me over and slapping my arms and my stomach and my back and my legs and so on and so forth. And then after, I don't know, it felt like an hour, but it's probably only 10 minutes. They say, there we are, you're done. And I got off and I could hardly walk. I felt like I had been physically attacked, that I had been physically sort of laid down and somebody just trampled all over me. And there are some people that do that week in, week out. They do it on a regular. I don't know how they could do that all the time. I've had one experience of it in life, and it's not something that I ever want to live through again. And I tell you this because that story, that account of something that I went through many years ago, that reminds me of the meaning of the Jebusite. Because the word Jebusite means thresher, and it refers to the agricultural activity of beating grain out of the husk. And to beat the grain out of the husk, you need real force and you need to really trample on it. It was usually done through animals such as ox, who were used to tread on the grain. They would walk around. The grain would be put on a threshing floor. That's why we call the Jebusite the threshers. And the ox would walk around and they would literally tread on it. They would thresh it. And they would just beat the life out of it to get what was needed out of it, to get the grain out of the husk. And that is what it felt like was happening to me in those Turkish baths all those years ago. I felt like these men were trying to beat something out of me, but I just didn't know what. But this is where we get the name Jebusite thresher. There's almost a violence to it, because you have to beat it. You don't get it out just by gently fiddling with it. You really have to put some brute force into it. And so from this we can infer that the Jebusite spirits of being threshers are spirits that tread on you, that stomp all over you. A Jebusite spirit would place a heaviness on you, so you would feel downtrodden and belittled and humiliated, and they would tell you either by words or actions that you're small and insignificant. And friends, in your life there may well be people who trample all over you. It may well be that for you at the moment, as you've just heard the opening to this sermon, it's really it's ringing a chord with you. It's striking a chord. There's something in you that says, there's a heaviness. You feel that whenever you come across these people, because it's as if they're crushing the very life out of you. But we also have to be mindful to see if we are the Jebusites, if we are the ones doing the trampling. For you see, this Jebusite spirit can live in us, and we can find that we are belittling others. By our actions and our words, we are the ones who are keeping someone else down. You can see this in all sorts of relationships, especially in the family. Parents, we can be crushing in how we speak to our children. A family can have a matriarchal or a patriarchal figure in their family, and whatever they say goes, and you always feel on edge when you're around them. And everyone is scared of that person. A marriage can have one spouse who's overbearing and dominant. A boss can be someone like the ox in the threshing floor that constantly treads over their employees. When I was around 10, I had a PE teacher. I didn't know it at the time, and it's only in later life that I've realized he had a Jebusite spirit within him. He basically treated me so badly with his words and his actions that I have no doubt in my mind that if the way he treated me was happening in a school today, he would have lost his job as a result of it. Because the way he treated me was nothing short of abuse. But it was okay back in the 1970s. That's how many teachers lived. Not all of them, can I just say. But you see, what I'm saying is this Jebusite spirit is all around us. And it's subtle, and we need to watch out for it. But it can also be within us to vary in different degrees. So let's not be complacent and think that we're fine, we're completely immune from it, because we're not. I can speak sometimes words that are way too harsh. And I can look in the eyes of my children, and the way that I've reacted, the way that I've spoken them has crushed them. And I need to be careful myself as a father in how I speak to them. Now, in the Bible, we can see that Pharisees were people who seemed to have a Jebusite spirit within them, as they loved legalism and suppressing anything that tried to speak against them and what they said. They were against any kind of spiritual authority unless it was their own, and they placed a heavy burden of accusations, oppression, condemnation and guilt on all that they met unless you bowed down to them. And so their actions could feel like they were treading on you, that they were threshing you. They were putting you on a huge soapy slab, if you like, and they were throwing and slapping you around. And I think this enemy, while evident in our society, sadly, you know what? I think it can also be evident in the church as well. There are people, sadly, in church who judge and condemn, and grace seems to be nowhere to be seen. And I just want to say, I don't agree with that. And I think we need to speak against that at all costs, at all points. You know, don't hear me wrong. This doesn't mean that there aren't issues in church life, in all of our lives, that they need to be addressed. Of course they do. But first and foremost, we're to be people that show grace above all else, because that is what's been shown by God to us. And we don't deserve God's grace, but he still shows it. So we need to show that to all that we meet, to all who we meet. You know, can I get personal for a little bit this morning? Speak to any minister, and they will tell you they have had their own fair share of Jebusite enemies attacking them, not from outside of the church, but from inside of the church, because there are people who will always seem to want to put you down. And so someone who has the Jebusite spirit is someone who treads all over you, always puts you down. They will always feel they're superior to you, and they'll make sure you know it. And the truth is, this spirit can do enormous damage to us, and that damage can last for years. It's the reason many people face feelings of insecurity, worthlessness, and insignificance. And it can be very subtle. And I think, you know, in one sense, I'm not against all forms of social media or technology and all of that. But I think one of the negative results of social media and the technological age in which we live is that it's easy to see this Jebusite spirit in action. It makes us feel that we have to compare ourselves to each other. It helps us make us feel, we look at somebody else, we hear what they say, and we feel less about ourselves. Cyberbullying is a very real problem, because people say all sorts of awful things to people over social media, email, or text platforms, and it's just a way of treading on others. There's no other way to put it. We can't excuse it. It's treading on other people. And you know, it's not just amongst young people that this happens. It happens in all forms, in all walks of life. But the wonderful news this morning, because all that sounds a little bit doom and gloom, doesn't it? But the wonderful news this morning is that God can defeat this. And that God did not make you to be downtrodden. It's not his will that people tread all over you. And if this is how you feel, listen on. Because God wants you to defeat this enemy, this giant in your lives. And if, you're somebody that you recognize that maybe you've had a bit of the Jebusite spirit within you, it's okay. The grace of God, the forgiveness of God is there for all of us. None of us are perfect. We all fall short of the glory of God. And so we can just come to him and we can say, God, I'm really sorry that I spoke to so-and-so that way. I'm really sorry that my actions made that person feel that way. And we can say sorry to God, and we can say sorry to each other. And when we do that, the Jebusite enemy hates it when we do that. But that is a way of us allowing God to defeat that spirit within us. Because we need to remember that this enemy, this spirit of the Jebusite, is completely opposite to Jesus' spirit, which is about humility, compassion, selfless attitude, tender-heartedness, grace, and so on. This is who Jesus is. We've mentioned the Pharisees, have we not, who were members of a particular school of thought in Jesus' day. They were very much into legalism and their own power, and they basically believed that they were right on everything. They did all they could to uphold the Jewish laws and condemn everyone who didn't uphold those Jewish laws, all 613 of them. If you look through the Bible, you'll often see the Pharisees have a heart that is totally opposite to Jesus, and they really didn't like Jesus, and so they tried to trick Jesus. They tried to suppress him at every turn. They want to stifle him. They try to oppose him and discourage him. They do all they can to keep him down. That is the Jebusite spirit. And as I said earlier, this enemy is seen clearly in the Pharisees in the Bible, and yet Jesus says, no, I want to show you a different way. I want us to live with a different spirit, with a different heart within us. Back in the Old Testament, people like Moses and Joshua in the Bible, they struggled with the idea of defeating these threshers, these people who would seek to put them down. In Deuteronomy in the Old Testament, there's an account of Moses handing over the reins of leadership to Joshua. Moses is an old guy by this point. The Bible tells us he's about 120 years old, and he's told that he's done all of this work, he's led the Israelites, but he is not going to be the one who leads them into the promised land. Man, a bit of a blow for him, but it is what it is. And so he calls Joshua, and he has this speech, and he talks to all this stuff, and as he hands over to Joshua, he tells him, he says, Joshua, the Lord says to be strong and courageous, not to be afraid or discouraged. I love that. I'll tell you why. Let me ask you, why do you think the great leader that we know in Joshua was told by Moses not to be afraid or discouraged? Well, the answer is simple. Because he was scared and he was discouraged. He was afraid. I find it a real help to know that the person who led the Israelites into the promised land, the person who, if you read through your Bible, you will see that Joshua was this. You come to the he was a great leader, and yet he was scared. He struggled with people trampling all over him. He was put down by the Jebusite enemy, and he felt small and insignificant, and because of that he's told to be strong and courageous, to not be discouraged, that God will never fail him, that God will always be with him. And I love the idea, I love the reality of this. I love the fact that Joshua, this great man of God, this great leader, felt discouraged and got scared. But I also love more the promise that God says, don't be strong and courageous, because I'm always with you. I'm never going anywhere. I'm not going to leave you. And so as we walk through life, as we walk through the current crisis, friends, God is with us. And as many are battling through and wondering what the new measures mean for their daily lives, many are discouraged and scared. But just as God said to Joshua, God's Spirit speaks to us that we too are not alone. And friends, if you hear nothing else today, I just want you to hear that you are not alone. But God is still with you. But this enemy is real and wants to trample on our hopes and our dreams. It wants to bring you down and discourage you. And to be discouraged means to deprive of courage, hope, or confidence. And when this happens, we can all too easily lose heart. And to lose heart means to stop believing that you can succeed. And the truth is that God has made you for more than this. God wants you to succeed. Paul speaks a little bit about this to the church in Corinth. And we read in 2 Corinthians chapter 4, "So we do not lose heart. Though our outer self is wasting away, our inner self is being renewed day by day." You see, up until this point, Paul has spoken of us having the mercy of God in our lives. And that with God, we can have a different life, a better, a more fulfilled life. Paul is well aware that there is stuff and there are people that can make life difficult for us, that the Christian life is not always the easiest. He knows that there are situations that at the time seem like they're the end of the world. But because of Jesus, because of what Jesus did on the cross and his resurrection, they're not the end of the world, because there's an eternity, there's more to life than what we know now. And because of that, he says, don't lose heart, don't give up. And this phrase, to lose heart, it's a hunting term. And it means to unstring your bow because of lack of seeing anything to shoot at. And many times in life we get discouraged and we lose heart. We aren't seeing any results. We're not seeing answers to prayer. We're just seeing battles. We aren't seeing our dreams come true. And life is just a battle. And so instead of just hanging in there, we lose heart. We unstring our bow and we shrink back. Our hope is gone and we allow ourselves to be pushed down. We give up. And that is exactly what the Jebusite spirit wants. It wants us to unstring our bow, to lose sight of our breakthrough, our promised land of blessing and our destiny. You see, God has a destiny for you. And the Jebusite spirit wants you to lose heart and not experience, not to live in that destiny. It wants to wear us out. So we unstring our bow and we stop fighting. Because as long as the enemy occupies our lives, we won't experience all that God has for us. You see, you fight all of the enemies with God, and so we need to fight the Jebusite enemy with God. So the challenge to us this morning is to string up our bows, to not lose heart. Life is tough at the moment, isn't it? There are many challenges and struggles that we're all facing, but we're reminded here to not lose heart, to hang in there with God. But outside of the coronavirus, when people are suppressing and oppressing us, when people are treading us down and threshing all of the life out of us, how do we fight? How do we stay strong and courageous when people are making us feel small and insignificant? How do we stay encouraged when all around us is seeking to discourage? I think the answer to this final enemy is quite a simple one. For the tool in our armory to fight the Jebusite spirit is simply to stay close to Jesus. I know that sounds obvious, but the reality is that when we feel attacked, many of us flee from Jesus. You know, when life is attacking you, when you're on that threshing floor and the oxen is treading all over you, it's easy to blame God. It's easy to walk, to stay away from God. And the trick of the Jebusite enemy is to get us to stay away from God because of the way it makes us feel guilty, worthless, useless, insecure, and so on, and 101 other emotions. And I believe the tool we need to pick up is found in some words that Jesus said in Matthew's Gospel, Matthew chapter 11, verses 28 to 30. And I'm reading it from the Message paraphrase because I just think this cuts right to the heart of it. Jesus says, "Are you tired, worn out, burned out on religion? Come to me, get away with me, and you'll recover your life. I'll show you how to take a real rest. Walk with me and work with me. Watch how I do it. Learn the unforced rhythms of grace. I won't lay anything heavy or ill-fitting on you. Keep company with me and you'll learn to live freely and lightly." Friends, when Jesus said we'll recover our lives, he understands that the Jebusite enemy seeks to rob us of our lives. It fights us so much that in the end we don't know who we really are. We don't really know what our lives are all about. It's such a strong enemy that Jesus says our lives need recovery. You know, when you've been through a trauma in your life, or you've been through an accident in your life, or you've been through an operation in your life, you don't instantly just get up and carry on, do you? You need a period of recovery. And Jesus says in life, when we're worn out and tired, not simply because we had a late night last night, this is because life has attacked us. And for some, life has attacked us for a long period of time. And this attacking is the Jebusite enemy having thrown us around on the threshing floor. When that happens, Jesus says we need to recover our lives. And we do this by spending time with Jesus. Friends, this is the tool to defeat the enemy. So how do we do that? Notice Jesus says when you're tired and burnt out, when you feel overwhelmed, what do you have to do? You have to keep walking and working with Jesus. He shows us these unforced rhythms of grace, which are light and fit us well. You see, the Jebusite spirit will seek to load us up with burdens and struggles of competition and legalism and a whole host of other things that are simply too heavy for you and I to carry around, and it literally drags us down. A few years ago, my father-in-law gave me some weights. He had some weights and he lent me some weights so I could lift those weights myself. And I've had a few hernia operations in my life, and because of it, I've got I'm basically a weakling. I've got very limited upper body strength. And he gave me these weights. Now, I don't know if the weights he gave me, that was fully what he lifted, but I felt it was. And I was lifting them, but it was basically too heavy for me. So I had to admit defeat. And I just wanted to lift weights. I didn't want to be beaten by my father-in-law. And so I wanted to lift the same as him, but I couldn't. It was ill-fitted. It was too heavy for me. And so reluctantly, I took a weight off, and then I found they were a lot easier and they fitted me better. But just to make sure that I wasn't completely weak, I made my son Reuben try to lift while I was lifting, and when he couldn't, that made me feel much better, so all was well with the world. But you see, Jesus says what he puts on us is light and fits us well. It's interesting that the whole idea of the threshing floor of this oxen trampling the wheat underfoot, they would have had a yoke. Many translations say, don't they, from this passage from Matthew, "Take my yoke upon you." And I used to think when I was younger, what does this yoke mean? Does it mean we're being covered in eggs? No, it doesn't mean we're being covered in eggs. A yoke was something that went round the neck of the ox, and it directed them. But what would happen is that would be a painful yoke. It would be a heavy yoke. So the ox were forced into which way they would go. And Jesus says, that is not how I will work. That's why you need to learn the unforced rhythms of my grace. Friends, the sad truth is that when we feel attacked by the Jebusite enemy, many retreat away from God. And it's at that precise moment that God says, retreat to me, get closer to me than you've ever been before. And when you do that, you find the strength to be strong and courageous to overcome this enemy, because you're walking and working with Jesus. You know, when this enemy attacks and we retreat from Jesus, we often find we react to the enemy in a bad way ourselves. That's been my experience. When I feel downtrodden, I react in a way that can be just as bad as they are. But you know, the reality is you don't fight fire with fire. We fight fire with water. And to fight this Jebusite enemy, we need to stay close to the water source, which is Jesus. So if you're fighting this enemy, I pray that you'll be able to get away with Jesus. Actually, I pray that you will make it a priority to choose to spend some quality time with Jesus, that you will watch how he does life and you will work with him, and then he will instill into the very core of your being his unforced rhythms of grace. And as you do that, this will send the enemy packing. It'll be running from your life, for this enemy cannot cope with anyone who is close to Jesus. I know it's hard. I know it can be all-consuming, but we have to allow ourselves to be consumed with Jesus as opposed to being consumed with this enemy. And it takes work, but it is so worth it. So there we are. We're done. That's all 7 enemies: Hittites, fear and depression. Girgashites gets us to focus on earthliness and a time when we didn't know Jesus. The Amorites, those that gossip and speak criticism into our lives. The Canaanites, addictions that are traded for spiritual blessings. The Perizzites, limited vision. Hivites, limiting our lives only to the pleasures of the world. And today the Jebusites, those who seek to tread us down. Friends, you will not defeat the enemy simply by praying and saying glibly, God will help me. Yes, he can. But often he helps us in ways that we haven't thought about, and in ways that we don't like or want. For we're told in the Bible we have to do battle. Friends, this series has been about us battling through things that we can enjoy the freedom that God has on offer for us. But as a word of warning, right now as we finish, we have to be willing to accept the answers that God gives us. You see, often we don't only do battle with these enemies, but one of the tricks of the enemies is to get us to do battle with God. Because God has a way for us to come through, but very often we don't like that way, we don't want that way, and so we don't pick that way up, and so we turn God down. Oh, I know we say we don't, but in reality, we do. You know, it's that illustration of the man who's on the roof of his house because there's a huge flood around him, and he prays to God to help him, believing that God will help him. And somebody comes on a boat and says, come in the boat and I can save you. No, it's okay, God's going to help me. Somebody comes in a helicopter. No, you go away. It's okay, God's going to help me. He turned everything down because he didn't feel that was how God was going to help him. God sometimes has has ways that we haven't thought of. You know, when we feel there's a dead end, God can open it up before us. So as a word of caution, as a word of warning, as we finish today, as we finish this series, when you ask God, pick up his tools to defeat the enemies. Fight in the way that he calls you to fight. And when you do that, then you will find the freedom. Let's pray together. Father, I just want to thank you for this series. I want to thank you that you don't leave us on our own in life, that no matter what we go through, no matter what enemy attacks us, you have a tool, you have a way out for us. You have a way that we can battle, and you battle with us. And for today, Father, with the Jebusites, Father, I pray for anybody that feels that they're being trodden on, anybody feels that they're in the threshing floor, and the ox is just beating everything out of them. Father, will you make a way for them where there seems to be no way? Father, will you teach them your unforced rhythms of grace? May you give them the courage to take your yoke upon them, and that they will see you, they will walk with Jesus, they will work with Jesus, they will put the effort, put the time in, and to see that life then has a freedom that they never knew before. Yeah, so Spirit of God, just fall anew and afresh on all who are feeling trampled on by this enemy. And give them your strength to endure. Give them, may they stay close to you, their source. Yeah, and may they see this enemy pack in and live in the freedom that you have for them. Yeah, bless them, I pray, Father. Thank you. Amen.